This storm just got way more serious overnight, and we need to talk about it right away because Tropical Storm Bertha has intensified faster than a lot of the guidance was expecting. And on top of that, we still have a separate flooding threat setting up across the southeast today. A slow-moving frontal boundary is going to interact with a deep plume of tropical moisture, and that combination is going to bring the risk of significant flash flooding to areas that are still recovering from heavy rain earlier this week. Meanwhile, Bertha's impacts are going to extend well beyond just the rain, with storm surge and increasingly gusty winds expected from the Florida Panhandle all the way over toward the Louisiana coastline. We have a very active next 48 hours ahead, so let's get right into the forecast. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's start with what's happening across the southeast, because honestly, the flooding threat today might end up being just as big of a story as the tropical storm itself. This is really an extension of the heavy rain that's already fallen over the past couple of days across Georgia and the Carolinas, and unfortunately, the ground is already saturated in a lot of these spots, which means it doesn't take much additional rainfall to start causing problems. The Storm Prediction Center does have a marginal risk of severe weather in place today, stretching from around Columbia, South Carolina, up through Fayetteville and into parts of eastern North Carolina. The primary concern with any storms that do turn severe will be damaging wind gusts. We're talking about the potential for 60 to 65 mile per hour gusts in the strongest cells. There's also a low-end chance for an isolated tornado somewhere in that corridor. Though I want to be clear, this is not looking like a widespread tornado outbreak by any means, more of an isolated threat if storm mode cooperates. Part of the reason the tornado threat is fairly limited today is that most of the instability is getting used up by all the ongoing rain and cloud cover across this corridor. When you have this much moisture and this much cloud cover already in place from earlier rounds of rain, it tends to cap how much destabilization can actually occur through the afternoon. That's generally good news from a tornado perspective, but it does mean the atmosphere is essentially loaded with moisture instead, which circles right back around to why the flooding threat is the bigger concern today. But like I said, I think the flooding threat is really going to be the headline today. We have a moderate risk of excessive rainfall in place for areas including Savannah, Charleston, and back up into Florence, South Carolina. This is the same general corridor that already picked up several inches of rain earlier in the week, and now we're expecting another round of training thunderstorms to set up right on top of that same area. When you get storm after storm moving over the exact same corridor, that's when you start seeing serious flash flooding because the ground simply cannot absorb any more water. We could be looking at another 5 to 6 inches of rain in the hardest hit spots today and tonight, with some localized totals potentially pushing towards 7 or 8 inches if a particularly persistent cluster of storms sets up and doesn't move much. This is a very dangerous setup, and if you live anywhere in this corridor, please have multiple ways to receive flash flood warnings. Today, and remember, if you come across a flooded roadway, turn around, don't drown. It is simply not worth the risk of trying to push through standing water, especially at night when it's much harder to judge how deep it actually is. Let's talk about the timing on this flooding threat. This morning, we're already seeing some scattered showers and thunderstorms developing across the coastal plain, and I expect this activity to become more numerous and more organized as we move through the late morning and into the afternoon. By around 1 or 2 o'clock this afternoon, I think we'll start to see a fairly continuous training pattern set up, with storm after storm moving along nearly the same track from the southwest to the northeast. This kind of training pattern is exactly the ingredient we don't want to see, given how saturated the ground already is. This activity should continue into the evening hours, and unfortunately, I don't expect much of a break overnight either. We could see additional rounds of heavy rain continuing right through the night and into tomorrow morning before this system finally starts to shift off to the north and east by tomorrow afternoon. So really, we're talking about a solid 18 to 24-hour window where the flooding threat is going to remain elevated, and that's a long time for water to keep piling up in these low-lying and flood-prone areas. Before we get into the tropical storm update, I do want to mention a new sponsor of today's forecast. A lot of you know how much we care about keeping our pets healthy, and that includes paying attention to what's actually going into their food. That's part of why we've been trying out Hearth Kitchen for dogs. It starts with real, whole ingredients like turkey, carrots, sweet potato, and salmon oil, and it's gently cooked, so you get real nutrition without a bunch of fillers or preservatives you can't pronounce. There's no thawing, no cooking on your end. Just scoop it into the bowl and you're done. It's honestly made mealtime a lot easier around here, and it's nice knowing exactly what's going into their diet every single day. If you've been thinking about switching up your dog's food, this is a solid place to start. You can get 25% off your first order using the link in the description, or use code STORMCHASER at checkout. Now let's get back into the forecast. All right, let's talk about Tropical Storm Bertha. because this is the part of today's forecast that has changed the most since our last update. Bertha has strengthened quite a bit over the past 12 to 18 hours, and maximum sustained winds are now up around 65 miles per hour, which puts it right at the edge of hurricane strength. I know that's going to raise some alarm bells for folks along the Gulf Coast, and I don't want to downplay it, because this is a notable increase from where we had this storm just yesterday. That said, I don't think this necessarily means Bertha is going to keep strengthening all the way into a hurricane. When you look at the satellite presentation, there's a very healthy area of deep convection wrapping most of the way around the center of circulation now, which is different from what we were seeing a couple of days ago when the storm was lopsided and struggling against shear. This more symmetric structure is exactly why it's been able to intensify as quickly as it has. However, there's also some slightly drier air trying to work into the western side of the circulation, and there's still some modest shear in the environment that could limit just how much stronger this gets before it makes landfall. Looking at the latest guidance from the National Hurricane Center, Bertha is expected to make landfall somewhere near the mouth of the Mississippi River later tonight, or in the very early morning hours tomorrow, likely as a strong tropical storm or possibly a low end. Category 1 hurricane if that intensification trend continues right up until landfall. Once it moves inland, we should see fairly rapid weakening, and by the time it's pushing into central Louisiana, I'd expect maximum sustained winds to be back down into the 40 to 50 mile per hour range. In terms of timing, over the next several hours, we should see conditions continue to deteriorate along the immediate coast, with tropical storm force winds likely expanding outward from the center. By this evening, the worst of the wind and storm surge should be arriving along the southeastern Louisiana coastline, and I'd expect the peak impacts, meaning the strongest winds and highest surge, to occur somewhere between about 9 p.m. tonight and 3 a.m. tomorrow morning as the center comes ashore. As far as rainfall goes, Bertha is a bit different from a lot of the tropical systems we've tracked recently in that it does have a fairly healthy amount of moisture wrapped around it now, given how much it's organized. I'd expect widespread rainfall totals of 4 to 6 inches along the immediate path of the center, with some spots potentially seeing 8 inches or more if any of the heavier bands train over the same location for an extended period. That kind of rainfall on top of storm surge is a recipe for significant flooding right along the coast, so this is not a storm to take lightly just because it's not officially a hurricane yet. Wind gusts are going to be a real concern as well. Right along the coast, near where the center comes ashore, I would not be surprised to see gusts in the 75 to 85 mile per hour range, which is enough to cause scattered power outages, downed trees, and damage to weaker structures. Moving inland a bit, toward areas like Houma and points north, gusts should still be in the 50 to 60 mile per hour range, and even as far away as Baton Rouge, you could still see some gusts approaching 40 to 45 miles per hour later tonight. If you're anywhere within that stretch from the immediate coast up through Baton Rouge, now is the time to make sure you have flashlights, batteries, and a way to charge your phone in case the power does go out overnight, given how saturated the ground already is in parts of this region from earlier. Rain, I'd also keep an eye out for downed trees, since root systems tend to lose their grip much more easily in soft, waterlogged soil, and that means even a moderately strong wind gust could bring down trees that would normally hold up just fine. Now let's talk about storm surge, because I think this might end up being the single biggest impact from Bertha, given how quickly it's strengthened. We're now forecasting up to 6 feet of storm surge from around the mouth of the Mississippi River back toward the Mississippi and Alabama border. And this has been increased from earlier forecasts, given the storm's recent intensification. For areas from around Mobile Bay back over toward the Florida Panhandle, we're looking at up to 4 feet of surge, and there's also a threat of 3 to 4 feet of surge extending westward toward Cameron and the southwestern Louisiana coastline. If you live anywhere along this stretch of coastline, please do not wait until the last minute to finish your preparations. Storm surge is historically one of the deadliest aspects of these systems, and given how much stronger Bertha has gotten in such a short window, this is exactly the kind of rapid intensification scenario that can catch people off guard if they were basing their decisions on yesterday's forecast rather than today's. I want to emphasize this point because it's such an important one every hurricane season. People sometimes look at a storm's category or its wind speed and use that as their only gauge of how dangerous it is. But storm surge doesn't care what category a system is. A fast-moving surge event from a strengthening tropical storm can still push a wall of water well inland in low-lying coastal communities, and that water can rise far faster than most people expect. If local officials issue any evacuation orders for low-lying areas along this stretch of coast, please take those seriously and don't wait to see how bad it gets before you leave. Once Bertha moves inland tomorrow, the primary threat transitions from wind and surge over to heavy rainfall and the potential for flash flooding as the remnant moisture gets pulled northward. There's still some uncertainty about exactly how far inland the heaviest rain bands will push, but areas from Baton Rouge up through Jackson, Mississippi. Should be prepared for the potential of another 3 to 5 inches of rain on Thursday, on top of whatever they may have already picked up. Given how saturated much of this region already is from earlier rounds of rain this month, I would not rule out some flash flooding concerns well away from the coast, as this system continues to weaken and pull apart on Thursday and into Friday. Looking further out, in terms of the broader pattern across the rest of the country, I don't see a lot of additional widespread severe weather setting up through the end of this week, outside of what we've already talked about today. A ridge of high pressure looks to build in across the central and southern plains, which should generally suppress severe thunderstorm development in that region for the next several days. However, by early next week, models are hinting at another dip in the jet stream digging into the Midwest and Ohio Valley, and that could set the stage for another round of more widespread severe weather sometime around Monday or Tuesday. We'll have a lot more detail on that as we get closer, and as the guidance becomes more consistent. So make sure you're subscribed to catch that update when it comes out. For right now, though, the two big stories remain the same. A serious and rapidly evolving flash flood threat across the southeast today and tonight, and a tropical storm Bertha that has intensified faster than expected and is bringing significant surge, wind, and rainfall impacts to the Gulf Coast as it approaches landfall. If you live anywhere in either of these threat areas, please take these forecasts seriously, have a plan in place, and make sure you have a reliable way to receive warnings throughout the day and overnight. As always, thank you all so much for watching today's forecast. If you're new to the channel, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any of our updates as this situation continues to evolve. And a big thank you again to Hearth Kitchen for sponsoring today's video. Definitely check them out using the link in the description below. We'll be back with another update as soon as there's meaningful new information on either the flooding threat or on Bertha's track and intensity. So stay tuned for that and stay safe out there tonight.